Standing at the polished mahogany table in Dataflow Solutions' executive boardroom, I clicked to the next slide of my presentation when my boss Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're done here," he announced to the 12 investors seated around us. "Pack up after this presentation." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as every eye shifted between Richard and me. I felt my stomach plummet, but somehow managed to keep my voice steady. "Thank you for that feedback, Richard." I turned back to the investors, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the laser pointer. As I was explaining, this encryption algorithm represents 18 months of intensive development. My mind raced while I maintained professional composure, the weight of betrayal settling heavily in my chest, knowing this moment would change everything. The silence stretched across the boardroom like a taut wire ready to snap. Patricia Williams, the lead investor from Meridian Capital, leaned forward in her chair, her silver hair catching the overhead lights, as confusion flickered across her features. "Richard, perhaps we should discuss personnel matters privately after the technical presentation concludes?" Richard straightened his navy tie and flashed that calculated smile I'd grown to despise over the past 3 weeks. "Patricia, I appreciate your concern, but transparency is essential in our partnership. Tammy's work has been adequate, certainly, but not the groundbreaking innovation we need for Series B funding." He gestured dismissively toward my laptop. "Jake Morrison, our new senior developer, will be taking over this project. His Stanford background brings the theoretical depth this algorithm requires." My fingers tightened around the presentation remote as the words hit like physical blows. Jake Morrison sat 3 chairs down from Patricia, his boyish face flushed red with embarrassment. At 24, he possessed brilliant coding skills, but lacked the mathematical foundations this encryption work demanded. Richard knew this, yet continued his calculated demolition of my career. "The quantum resistance protocols Tammy developed show promise," Richard continued, his tone patronizing, "but lack the sophistication our institutional clients expect. Jake's blockchain integration approach will revolutionize how financial institutions handle sensitive data transfers." I watched Patricia's expression shift from confusion to concern. She'd worked with me directly on 3 previous technical reviews, asking detailed questions about cryptographic theory that I'd answered with confidence, while Richard remained conspicuously silent. Now she studied Richard's face, clearly processing the disconnect between his claims and her direct experience with my expertise. The past 3 weeks replayed in my mind like a cruel movie. Finding Richard hunched over my desk at 11:30 p.m., claiming he'd forgotten his security badge and needed to retrieve files from my workstation. Discovering my personal research notebooks had been photographed, evident from subtle changes in their positioning. Noticing Richard's sudden fluency in quantum cryptography terminology during client calls, using phrases I'd coined in my documentation. Sarah Chen from Human Resources sat at the far end of the table, her usual warm demeanor replaced by visible discomfort. She'd scheduled 2 unexpected performance review meetings recently, asking questions that felt more like interrogations than standard evaluations. Now I understood why she'd seemed so uncomfortable during those sessions, probably knowing Richard's termination plans while being bound by corporate confidentiality. Furthermore, Richard continued, warming to his performance, Tammy's inability to collaborate effectively has created friction within our development team. Innovation requires synergy, not territorial behavior around code ownership. This accusation stung worse than the others because it inverted reality completely. I'd mentored 6 junior developers over my 3 years at Dataflow, including Jake himself when he'd joined the team 6 months ago. My code reviews were thorough but encouraging, and I'd never refused to share knowledge or techniques with colleagues. Jake cleared his throat tentatively. "Actually, Richard, Tammy has been incredibly helpful with my integration into the cryptography team. She spent hours explaining the mathematical foundations I needed to understand the existing code base." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Jake, your loyalty is admirable but misplaced. Leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions about personnel optimization." I forced myself to remain silent, though my mind churned with responses. This orchestrated humiliation served multiple purposes for Richard. Publicly firing me during our most critical investor presentation demonstrated his authority while positioning himself as the decisive leader these venture capitalists expected. Simultaneously, he could claim credit for my algorithm's innovation while eliminating the person who could challenge his technical understanding. Patricia shifted in her seat, her business instincts clearly detecting something problematic in Richard's approach. Richard, I'd prefer to complete the technical presentation before addressing organizational changes. Our due diligence process requires comprehensive understanding of the underlying technology. Of course, Richard replied smoothly. Tammy can finish her overview. Then Jake will present the enhanced implementation strategies we've developed. The word we felt like sandpaper against my consciousness. Richard had contributed nothing to this algorithm's development beyond approving my research timeline and requesting regular progress updates. Every breakthrough, every solved problem, every innovative approach had emerged from my work, often during solitary weekend sessions in my apartment when inspiration struck at unexpected moments. I clicked to my next slide, displaying the algorithm's core architecture. The foundation of this encryption system rests on elliptic curve cryptography, enhanced with quantum-resistant protocols. The innovation lies in dynamic key generation that adapts to attack patterns in real time. My voice remained steady despite the emotional turmoil raging inside me. 18 months of 12-hour days, countless nights debugging implementation details, and breakthrough moments when mathematical elegance finally emerged from chaos, all reduced to adequate, but not groundbreaking by someone who couldn't explain the difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption without consulting Wikipedia. As I continued the presentation, Richard's confident expression began to waver slightly. Patricia and two other investors asked increasingly technical questions about implementation details, computational complexity, and security proofs. Richard's responses became vague generalizations while I provided specific mathematical explanations and performance benchmarks. The algorithm's efficiency represents a 40% improvement over current industry standards, I explained, showing comparative performance charts. This efficiency gain becomes crucial when processing thousands of simultaneous transactions in enterprise environments. Impressive metrics, commented David Kumar from Stellar Ventures. Richard, how does your team plan to scale this technology across different client architectures? Richard paused for several seconds too long before responding. That's precisely why we're transitioning leadership to Jake. His distributed systems expertise will ensure robust scalability across diverse infrastructure requirements. I caught Jake's subtle wince at being positioned as Richard's technical proxy. He possessed strong programming skills, but had never designed enterprise-scale cryptographic systems. Richard was setting him up to fail while claiming credit for any successes and blaming Jake for inevitable problems. The boardroom's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the investors exchanged glances, their venture capital experience likely alerting them to the disconnect between Richard's claims and the technical reality they were witnessing. Patricia took careful notes while studying Richard's face, her expression suggesting mounting skepticism about his leadership capabilities. Richard clapped his hands together with false enthusiasm. I think this overview provides excellent foundation for Jake to present our enhanced implementation roadmap. Tammy, thank you for your service to Dataflow Solutions. The dismissal hung in the air like poison gas. I saved my presentation files and closed my laptop. The mechanical clicks unnaturally loud in the silent boardroom. Every person around that table understood they'd witnessed something ugly and unprofessional, but venture capital politics prevented direct intervention in personnel decisions. I'll need approximately 30 minutes to transition my materials to Jake, I said calmly, though my hands shook slightly as I packed my presentation equipment. Take whatever time you need, Patricia replied, her tone conveying more support than her words explicitly offered. As I walked toward the boardroom door, I heard Richard beginning his transition to Jake's portion of the presentation, his voice carrying that artificial confidence men use when they're desperately hoping nobody will notice their incompetence. In 30 minutes, he expected to own my algorithm completely, with Jake as his technical figurehead and me eliminated as potential opposition. He had no idea that his arrogance was about to become his downfall. My hands trembled as I opened my desk drawers, the familiar chaos of cable adapters and sticky notes now feeling foreign and temporary. The cubicle that had been my professional home for 3 years suddenly resembled a crime scene where my career had been murdered in broad daylight. Colleagues walked past with downcast eyes, their discomfort palpable as news of my termination spread through the office like wildfire. The personal items I'd accumulated told the story of my dedication to data flow solutions: a coffee mug from our successful product launch 2 years ago, a small succulent plant that had survived countless late-night coding sessions, framed certificates from cryptography conferences where I'd presented research that enhanced our company's reputation in the cybersecurity industry. "Tammy, I'm so sorry about what just happened." The voice belonged to Marcus Thompson, a database architect who'd worked closely with me on several integration projects. His usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by genuine concern and barely contained anger. Richard's behavior in there was completely unprofessional. "Everyone knows this algorithm is your brainchild." I managed a weak smile while continuing to pack. "Thanks, Marcus. That means more than you know." My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. The shock hadn't fully worn off yet, leaving me functioning on autopilot while my brain struggled to process the magnitude of what had occurred. "Is there anything I can do? Character references? LinkedIn recommendations? Anything at all?" Marcus leaned against my cubicle wall, his frustration evident. "Half the engineering team is talking about updating their resumes. Richard's decision-making has been questionable for months, but this crosses every line of professional decency." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, my former graduate advisor and current mentor. "Heard through the academic grapevine about data flow situation. Call me immediately. This may not be over. Important legal considerations we discussed previously." Dr. Rodriguez had warned me about intellectual property vulnerabilities in corporate environments during my final semester. She'd emphasized the importance of maintaining personal documentation of any research that built upon my graduate work. At the time, her advice seemed overly cautious. Now it felt prophetic. I excused myself from Marcus and headed toward the shared printer area, hoping to collect any final documents before leaving the building permanently. The printer bay sat adjacent to Richard's office, where I could hear him speaking animatedly on a conference call, probably spinning my termination as strategic workforce optimization for the investors. The printer's output tray contained the usual mixture of forgotten documents, abandoned presentations, and administrative forms. I gathered my legitimate files, then noticed several pages that made my blood run cold. Patent application documents bearing yesterday's filing date, with Richard's name listed as primary inventor and Jake as co-inventor for dynamic quantum-resistant cryptographic key generation system. My algorithm. My 18 months of work. My breakthrough insights. All officially attributed to 2 people who couldn't explain the mathematical foundations if their careers depended on it, which ironically they now did. The patent application included detailed technical descriptions lifted verbatim from my personal research documentation, phrases I'd crafted during solitary brainstorming sessions, mathematical proofs I'd developed through trial and error, even specific variable names I'd chosen for their mnemonic value. Every element of intellectual contribution had been systematically stolen and repackaged as Richard's innovation. My legs felt weak as I found a nearby chair and studied the documents more carefully. Richard had been planning this theft for weeks, possibly months. The filing date of yesterday meant he'd submitted these papers before terminating me, ensuring his legal claim preceded any potential challenge I might mount. His confidence during the boardroom humiliation now made perfect sense. He believed he'd eliminated any threat to his fraudulent ownership, but Richard had made a critical error in his calculated theft. The algorithm's core innovation didn't originate at Dataflow Solutions. It grew from theoretical work I'd completed during graduate school, 14 months before joining the company. My master's thesis had explored quantum-resistant cryptographic foundations, and I'd continued developing these concepts in personal research long before Dataflow hired me. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page of the patent application, ensuring I had complete documentation of Richard's fraud. The evidence was damning, but I needed to verify something crucial before taking any action. Racing back to my cubicle, I opened my laptop and accessed the company's code repository. The algorithm implementation stored on Dataflow's servers contained subtle but significant flaws that I'd deliberately introduced 6 months ago when I'd grown suspicious of Richard's unusual interest in my work. The corrected version existed only in my personal files, backed up to encrypted cloud storage that Dataflow couldn't access. Marcus noticed my sudden urgency. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," something like that. I continued typing, verifying that the flawed version remained unchanged in the company repository. Richard and Jake were about to demonstrate an encryption system with critical vulnerabilities that would expose any client data to sophisticated attacks. They had no idea because neither understood the mathematics deeply enough to recognize the problems. My phone rang with Dr. Rodriguez's number. "Tammy, I've been thinking about our previous conversations regarding intellectual property protection. Did you maintain personal documentation of research that predated your employment?" "Every notebook, every breakthrough, every dead end," I replied, my voice growing stronger. "Plus time-stamped cloud backups of all development iterations." "Good. I'm connecting you with Thomas Chen, an intellectual property attorney who specializes in employee inventor rights. He's handled several high-profile cases where companies attempted to steal innovations derived from pre-employment research. Based on what I'm hearing, you may have stronger legal standing than your former employer realizes." The pieces were falling into place. Richard's arrogance had blinded him to the legal vulnerabilities in his theft. He'd assumed that corporate employment automatically transferred all intellectual property rights, but graduate research performed before joining Dataflow remained my property, especially when that research formed the foundation for subsequent innovations. I spent the next hour methodically documenting everything. Screenshots of code repositories, showing implementation timelines, photographs of the fraudulent patent application, email timestamps proving my ownership of key concepts, personal notebooks with dated entries showing algorithm development beginning long before my Dataflow employment. Jake approached hesitantly as I prepared to leave. "Tammy, I want you to know I had no idea Richard was planning this. He asked me to review your code last week, claiming it was for integration planning. I never imagined he'd file patents listing me as co-inventor." His confession provided the final piece of evidence I needed. Richard had manipulated Jake into unwitting participation, creating additional legal liability, while exposing both of them to charges of patent fraud. "Jake, you need to protect yourself," I advised carefully. "Document everything Richard asked you to review and any conversations about intellectual property. You're being set up as his technical fall guy." As I packed the last of my personal items, my phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Chen's law office. "Available for emergency consultation at 4 p.m. today." Dr. Rodriguez briefed me on preliminary details. "Bring all documentation. This situation may be more serious than your former employer understands." I looked around the cubicle that had been my professional home, no longer feeling like a victim of corporate betrayal. Richard had overplayed his hand, creating legal vulnerabilities that could destroy his career while validating mine. His theft was about to become his catastrophic mistake. Walking toward the elevator, I felt something shift inside me. The shock and humiliation were transforming into cold, calculated determination. Richard wanted to play corporate warfare using stolen intellectual property as his weapon. He had no idea he'd just declared war on someone who understood both the technology and the law better than he did. The elevator doors closed, and I realized this wasn't the end of my story at Dataflow Solutions. It was the beginning of Richard's downfall. Thomas Chen's law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown tower, its walls lined with legal texts and framed certificates that spoke to decades of intellectual property expertise. The attorney himself appeared younger than I'd expected, with keen dark eyes that studied my documentation with the intensity of a detective examining crime scene evidence. "This is remarkable preparation," Thomas said, spreading my printed materials across his conference table. "Most clients arrive with fragmented memories and wishful thinking. You've documented a systematic theft with precision that would impress federal investigators." I'd spent 3 hours organizing my evidence before this meeting. Personal research notebooks dating back to graduate school, time-stamped cloud storage logs, email threads proving conceptual ownership, and photographs of Richard's fraudulent patent filing. The documentation told an undeniable story of premeditated intellectual property theft. "The foundation of your case rests on prior art establishment," Thomas explained, pointing to my graduate thesis excerpts. "Your master's research clearly demonstrates quantum-resistant cryptographic innovations developed 14 months before dataflow employment. This creates a temporal barrier that invalidates their patent claims. But I had something even more devastating than prior art documentation. Thomas, there's an additional factor Richard doesn't understand." I opened my laptop and displayed 2 code versions side by side. The algorithm implementation stored on Dataflow's servers contains critical security vulnerabilities that I introduced deliberately 6 months ago. Thomas leaned forward with interest. "Explain the strategic implications." "The flawed version will fail catastrophically under specific attack scenarios, potentially exposing client data and creating massive liability for any company that implements it. The corrected version exists only in my personal possession." I highlighted the problematic code sections. Richard filed patents based on documentation that describes a fundamentally broken system. The attorney's expression shifted to something approaching amazement. "So they've claimed ownership of intellectual property that's essentially worthless, while you maintain the only functional implementation." "Exactly. And tomorrow they're planning to demonstrate this flawed system to potential clients, possibly signing implementation contracts based on technology that would violate federal data protection standards." Thomas made rapid notes while processing the legal ramifications. "This transforms your case from simple patent dispute to potential criminal fraud charges. If Dataflow signs contracts promising security capabilities their algorithm cannot deliver, Richard and potentially Jake face criminal liability for fraudulent misrepresentation." We spent 2 hours developing a comprehensive legal strategy. Thomas would file immediate cease and desist letters, demanding Dataflow halt all patent processes and client demonstrations, pending resolution of prior art claims. Simultaneously, he'd prepare federal complaints alleging patent fraud and potential criminal charges for willful infringement of established intellectual property rights. "The timing favors aggressive action," Thomas noted. "Richard's confidence in his theft creates overreach vulnerabilities. He'll likely refuse our initial demands, creating additional evidence of willful infringement that strengthens potential criminal charges. But I had one more strategic advantage Richard couldn't anticipate. Thomas, I want to request permission to present final algorithm refinements to Dataflow's board before formally initiating legal proceedings." The attorney raised his eyebrows skeptically. "That seems unnecessarily risky. Why alert them to your legal preparations?" "Because Richard's arrogance will compel him to maintain his theft narrative even when presented with evidence of the algorithm's flaws. His public commitment to broken technology will create irreversible legal exposure while demonstrating his incompetence to the investors." Thomas studied my proposal carefully. "This approach maximizes both legal leverage and professional vindication, but requires precise execution. One mistake could compromise our entire strategy." We refined the plan over the next hour. I would request a brief return to Dataflow under the pretense of ensuring smooth transition documentation. During this visit, I'd present what appeared to be final technical refinements to the board, actually demonstrating the critical flaws in Richard's stolen implementation while revealing the corrected version remained in my exclusive possession. "Your termination gives this approach particular power," Thomas observed. "Richard cannot claim employee obligations or proprietary restrictions when you're no longer bound by corporate confidentiality agreements. By the time I left Thomas's office, we'd established a comprehensive legal framework that transformed my victimization into Richard's nightmare. His theft wasn't just morally wrong. It was legally catastrophic, potentially exposing him to criminal charges while destroying his professional credibility. I spent that evening preparing materials for tomorrow's confrontation, organizing evidence with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building an airtight case. My personal research notebooks told an undeniable story of innovation and dedication. The time-stamped development logs proved intellectual ownership beyond reasonable doubt. The documented flaws in Dataflow's implementation demonstrated Richard's complete incompetence, but the most powerful weapon in my arsenal was Richard's own arrogance. He'd committed himself publicly to technology he didn't understand, claiming ownership of innovations he couldn't explain. Tomorrow, that overconfidence would become his professional suicide. I called Dr. Rodriguez to update her on the legal developments. "Tammy, I'm proud of your strategic thinking, but concerned about the personal risks. Corporate retaliation can be vicious when executives feel threatened. Dr. Rodriguez, Richard has already destroyed my career at Dataflow. The only question now is whether I'll let him profit from his theft or expose him as the fraud he is. Just remember that victory in these situations comes not from revenge, but from justice that protects other innovators facing similar exploitation." Her words resonated deeply. This wasn't just about reclaiming my stolen work. It was about establishing precedent that would protect other technical professionals from intellectual property theft. My case could strengthen legal protections for employee inventors while demonstrating the professional consequences of corporate fraud. I spent the final hours reviewing every detail of tomorrow's presentation, anticipating Richard's responses and preparing for various scenarios. He would try to maintain control through authority and intimidation, but I possessed something he lacked completely: comprehensive understanding of both the technology and the legal framework protecting it. Tomorrow would determine whether Richard's theft succeeded or destroyed his career. But tonight, I felt confident that justice was about to prevail in ways he couldn't imagine. The Dataflow boardroom felt different when I returned the next morning, the same polished mahogany table now resembling a battlefield where the previous day's humiliation would be transformed into strategic vindication. Patricia Williams and her fellow investors occupied the same seats, their expressions curious about my unexpected return. Richard sat at the head of the table with Jake beside him, his confident demeanor betraying no awareness that his professional destruction was about to begin. "Thank you for accommodating this brief technical transition," I began, connecting my laptop to the presentation system. Yesterday's termination happened so quickly that important implementation details weren't properly conveyed. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tammy, Jake and I have thoroughly reviewed your documentation. Additional explanations aren't necessary." "Actually," Patricia interjected, "we'd welcome any insights that ensure smooth technology transfer. Our due diligence process requires comprehensive understanding of potential implementation challenges." I clicked to my first slide, displaying the algorithm's core cryptographic functions. The quantum-resistant protocols rely on elliptic curve mathematics that create specific computational vulnerabilities under certain attack scenarios. Jake leaned forward with genuine interest, his technical curiosity overriding the awkwardness of yesterday's events. Richard, however, maintained his dismissive expression, clearly believing this presentation was merely a desperate attempt to regain relevance. "For example," I continued, highlighting specific code segments, "the key generation function includes recursive loops that create exponential computational complexity when processing prime factorization attacks above certain threshold values." "Fascinating technical details," Richard interrupted with patronizing tolerance. "But our implementation team has thoroughly analyzed these considerations." "Excellent," I replied smoothly. "Then you can explain how your current implementation handles the Miller-Rabin primality testing vulnerability that occurs when the random witness selection algorithm encounters composite numbers with specific mathematical properties." The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over Richard's head. Jake's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as he realized he didn't understand the technical implications. Richard's face reddened slightly as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal his complete ignorance. "Those are implementation details that Jake will address during the development phase," Richard finally managed. "Actually, they're fundamental design flaws that would expose any client data to sophisticated attacks," I corrected, advancing to my next slide. "The current algorithm version fails catastrophically when attackers exploit the discrete logarithm problem using Pollard's row algorithm enhanced with parallel processing capabilities." Patricia and David Kumar exchanged glances, their venture capital experience alerting them to the disconnect between Richard's confident claims and the technical reality I was revealing. "Furthermore," I continued, warming to my demonstration, "the encryption implementation violates federal information processing standards by using insufficient key derivation functions that don't meet NIST requirements for financial institution data protection." Jake spoke up tentatively. "Tammy, I've reviewed the code extensively and didn't identify these vulnerabilities. Could you show us specifically where these problems occur?" I opened the Dataflow code repository and displayed the implementation directly from their servers. Line 237 through 255 contain the problematic key generation logic. The random number generator uses a linear congruential algorithm that creates predictable patterns after approximately 16,000 iterations. The technical details flew over Richard's head completely, but Jake began examining the code with growing alarm. His Stanford computer science background provided sufficient foundation to recognize the security implications I was describing. This would mean our encryption could be broken by anyone with moderate computational resources and basic cryptanalysis knowledge, Jake said, his voice betraying mounting horror. "Precisely," I confirmed. "Any financial institution implementing this system would face massive data breach liability and potential federal violations of client privacy protection standards." Richard's composure finally cracked. "These are theoretical vulnerabilities that won't impact real-world implementation. Tammy is engaging in fear-mongering to undermine legitimate business development. Actually, they're documented attack vectors that I can demonstrate live," I replied, opening a secondary application. "This simulation shows exactly how an attacker would exploit the key generation vulnerability to decrypt supposedly secure financial transactions." The demonstration took less than 3 minutes. My simulation broke the Dataflow algorithm's encryption in real time, revealing hypothetical bank account numbers, social security numbers, and transaction details that should have remained absolutely secure. The investors watched in stunned silence as their $12 million investment revealed itself to be built on fundamentally flawed technology. "This is impossible," Richard sputtered. "Our preliminary testing showed robust security across all threat scenarios. Your testing was inadequate because it didn't account for mathematical vulnerabilities that require cryptographic expertise to identify," I explained calmly. "The corrected implementation addresses these flaws through enhanced random number generation and modified key derivation protocols." Patricia leaned forward with sharp focus. "Tammy, you're saying a corrected version exists that resolves these security problems?" "Yes. But that version was developed using my personal research and exists exclusively in my possession. The implementation stored on Dataflow's servers represents an earlier development stage that I never finished debugging." The implications crashed over Richard like a tidal wave. He'd stolen incomplete work, filed fraudulent patents based on fundamentally broken technology, and committed his company to investor promises they couldn't fulfill. Jake sat in stunned silence as he realized his unwitting participation in intellectual property theft involving worthless algorithms. "This is ridiculous," Richard declared desperately. "Tammy's claims are unsupported speculation designed to sabotage legitimate business operations." But his protest carried no technical weight. The demonstrated vulnerabilities were mathematically undeniable, and the investors possessed enough due diligence experience to recognize genuine security flaws when presented with concrete evidence. David Kumar spoke up with obvious concern. "Richard, these revelations suggest significant gaps in your technical evaluation processes. How did such fundamental vulnerabilities escape detection during development?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, just as the boardroom door burst open. Dataflow's legal counsel, Margaret Foster, entered with obvious urgency, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "I apologize for the interruption," Margaret announced. "But we have an immediate legal situation that requires board attention." Richard's face went pale as Margaret whispered urgently in his ear. The investors exchanged alarmed glances while Jake sat frozen in his chair, clearly recognizing that the situation had escalated far beyond technical disagreements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret addressed the room, her voice carefully controlled. "We've received legal correspondence that requires immediate executive consultation." I maintained perfect composure while internally celebrating the precision of Thomas Chen's timing. Richard's confidence was about to transform into terror as the full scope of his legal exposure became clear. Margaret Foster's hands trembled slightly as she distributed copies of Thomas Chen's legal correspondence to each board member. The cease and desist letter bore the letterhead of Chen, Rodriguez, and Associates, a firm whose reputation in intellectual property litigation was apparently familiar to several investors based on their expressions of recognition and concern. This cease and desist order alleges that Mr. Patterson filed fraudulent patent applications using intellectual property that predates Dataflow employment and remains under protection of prior art statutes, Margaret explained, her voice betraying none of the composure that had made her Dataflow's trusted legal counsel for 8 years. Patricia Williams studied the documents with the analytical precision that had built her venture capital reputation. The filing includes extensive documentation supporting prior invention claims, including time-stamped research logs and graduate school thesis excerpts dating back over 2 years. Richard's face had drained of all color as the magnitude of his legal exposure became apparent. This is a desperate attempt by a disgruntled former employee to undermine legitimate business operations through frivolous litigation threats. Actually, Margaret corrected grimly. The documentation appears comprehensive and potentially devastating. The cease and desist includes sworn affidavits from Dr. Affidavits, Ellen Rodriguez at State University, confirming the temporal precedence of cryptographic research that forms the foundation of our algorithm. Jake slumped in his chair as understanding dawned. "Richard, you told me this was original Dataflow development. You never mentioned prior art considerations or potential patent conflicts. Furthermore," Margaret continued, "the legal filing alleges willful patent infringement, with potential criminal implications under federal intellectual property statutes. If these claims prove accurate, both primary and co-inventors could face criminal charges for fraudulent patent filing." The word criminal hung in the boardroom air like a toxic cloud. David Kumar set down his copy of the legal documents and fixed Richard with a stare that could have melted steel. "Richard, explain immediately how our due diligence process failed to identify prior art conflicts in our core technology." Richard's response dissolved into incoherent stammering about employee obligations and corporate intellectual property policies. His complete inability to address the specific legal allegations confirmed what the investors were beginning to understand. Their CEO had committed fraud that threatened the entire company's viability. "The situation deteriorates further," Margaret announced reluctantly. "The filing includes expert technical analysis demonstrating that the current algorithm implementation contains critical security vulnerabilities that would violate federal data protection standards." Patricia's expression hardened as the full scope of the crisis became clear. "Margaret, are you telling us that our core technology is both stolen and fundamentally broken? The technical analysis suggests substantial problems with the implementation stored on our servers, while claiming that corrected versions exist only in the complainant's possession." I maintained careful silence while the legal earthquake devastated Richard's position. Thomas Chen's strategy was unfolding exactly as planned, creating multiple converging pressures that would force Dataflow to choose between supporting fraudulent leadership or protecting their business interests. Jake finally found his voice. "I need legal representation immediately. I was deceived into unwitting participation in patent fraud and refused to accept criminal liability for Richard's actions." That's premature panic, Richard protested weakly. These allegations are unsubstantiated claims that our legal team will easily refute. Margaret's expression suggested otherwise. Richard, the documentation supporting these claims is extraordinarily comprehensive. The complainant has maintained detailed records that would be difficult to challenge in federal court. Additionally, she continued, our liability extends beyond patent fraud to potential client contract violations. If we've promised encryption capabilities our technology cannot deliver, we face substantial financial exposure for fraudulent misrepresentation. The investors began whispering among themselves in urgent, hushed tones. Venture capital firms possessed sophisticated legal teams specifically trained to identify threats to investment security. Their rapid consultation suggested they recognized the severity of Dataflow's position. Patricia stood up abruptly. This meeting is suspended pending comprehensive legal review. Richard, you're temporarily relieved of operational authority until board resolution of these allegations. You can't do this, Richard sputtered desperately. I've built this company from nothing. One disgruntled employee cannot destroy years of legitimate business development. Actually, David Kumar replied coldly, fraudulent patent filing and willful theft of intellectual property can absolutely destroy years of business development. The question now is whether Dataflow can survive your catastrophic leadership failures. Margaret gathered her legal documents while addressing the room generally. I'm recommending immediate consultation with external intellectual property counsel specializing in federal fraud defense. Our current situation requires expertise beyond my corporate law background. As the investors filed out for emergency consultation, Jake approached me hesitantly. Tammy, I'm sorry for my unwitting participation in this disaster. I genuinely believed Richard when he claimed this was original Dataflow innovation. Jake, protect yourself by documenting everything Richard told you about intellectual property ownership and patent filing. Your cooperation could be crucial for resolving this situation favorably. Richard remained seated at the conference table in stunned silence, apparently unable to process the complete destruction of his professional credibility. Yesterday, he'd commanded respect and authority. Today, he faced potential criminal charges and certain career annihilation. Margaret approached me as I packed my presentation materials. Miss Patterson, would you be available for discussion regarding potential resolution of these legal allegations? My attorney, Thomas Chen, is handling all formal communications, I replied diplomatically. However, I remain interested in outcomes that protect Dataflow's employees and investors, while ensuring appropriate accountability for intellectual property theft. As I walked toward the boardroom exit, I heard Patricia's voice from the hallway where the investors had gathered for emergency consultation. Gentlemen, we need to consider complete leadership replacement and comprehensive legal settlement to salvage this investment. Richard's theft had created exactly the catastrophic exposure Thomas Chen had predicted. His arrogance had blinded him to legal vulnerabilities that were now destroying not just his career, but potentially the entire company he'd claimed to lead effectively. Walking toward the elevator, I realized that justice was unfolding with mathematical precision, each legal pressure point creating leverage that would ultimately force Richard to face consequences for his fraudulent behavior. The emergency board session reconvened 3 hours later in Dataflow's smaller conference room, the venue change reflecting the company's suddenly diminished circumstances. Patricia Williams had assumed unofficial leadership during the crisis, her venture capital experience providing the strategic thinking this situation demanded. Richard sat isolated at one end of the table, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone watching their world collapse in real time. After extensive consultation with external intellectual property counsel, Patricia announced, "The board has concluded that immediate action is necessary to protect Dataflow's viability and our investors' interests." Margaret Foster had returned with additional legal reinforcement. Jonathan Blackwell from Morrison, Blackwell and Associates, a firm specializing in federal fraud defense and corporate crisis management. His presence signaled that Dataflow was treating this situation with the seriousness it deserved. Mr. Patterson's actions have created multiple layers of legal exposure, Jonathan explained grimly. Patent fraud carries potential criminal penalties, including substantial fines and imprisonment. Willful intellectual property theft compounds these vulnerabilities while creating civil liability for damages that could exceed our insurance coverage. David Kumar leaned forward intently. Jonathan, what options exist for minimizing corporate exposure while addressing the complainant's legitimate grievances? Comprehensive settlement negotiations represent our best path forward, combined with immediate leadership changes that demonstrate corporate commitment to ethical business practices. Richard finally found his voice. This is an overreaction to frivolous accusations from someone seeking revenge for legitimate termination. I refuse to accept blame for proper corporate intellectual property management. The room fell silent as everyone processed Richard's continued denial of obvious reality. Even Jake shook his head in disbelief at Richard's inability to acknowledge the scope of his fraudulent behavior. Richard, Patricia said with icy precision, your refusal to accept responsibility for systematic intellectual property theft demonstrates exactly why you're unfit to lead this organization. She turned to address the broader room. The board has voted unanimously to terminate Richard Patterson for cause, effective immediately. His actions have violated corporate ethics policies, federal law, and fiduciary responsibilities to our investors and employees. Richard's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: shock, anger, denial, and finally something approaching panic as the reality of his situation penetrated his arrogance. You can't terminate me. I own 30% of this company. Your ownership stake doesn't protect you from criminal liability or exempt you from accountability for fraudulent behavior, Jonathan replied flatly. In fact, your equity position increases potential damages if civil litigation proceeds to judgment. Margaret opened a folder containing additional legal documents. Richard, we're prepared to offer limited cooperation with federal investigators. In exchange for your resignation and relinquishment of all patent claims related to the disputed algorithm. Furthermore, Patricia continued, the board is prepared to offer comprehensive resolution to Ms. Patterson that addresses both her legitimate intellectual property claims and appropriate compensation for the damages caused by your theft. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Chen, Dataflow Legal Counsel, requesting immediate settlement negotiations. Recommend accepting their proposal for emergency consultation. I looked around the room at faces that had witnessed my humiliation 24 hours earlier, now united in recognition that justice required dramatic action. Jake sat with visible relief, apparently understanding that Richard's termination would eliminate his unwitting participation in patent fraud. I'm willing to discuss resolution terms that protect Dataflow's employees and investors, I announced. However, any agreement must include appropriate accountability measures and structural changes preventing future intellectual property theft. Patricia nodded approvingly. We're prepared to offer you the Chief Technology Officer position with full authority over cryptographic development and substantial equity participation that reflects your algorithmic innovations. The offer hit me like a physical blow, transforming my status from terminated employee to senior executive in less than 24 hours. Richard's theft had backfired so completely that it created the exact opposite outcome he'd intended. Additionally, David Kumar added, we're proposing immediate licensing agreements for your corrected algorithm implementation with substantial upfront payments and ongoing royalties that recognize your intellectual property ownership. Jonathan consulted his notes. The licensing structure would provide $2 million in immediate compensation, plus 20% royalties on all client implementations, ensuring long-term financial recognition of your innovations. Richard sat in stunned silence as his former victim became Dataflow's most valuable asset while he faced potential criminal prosecution and certain professional destruction. The mathematical precision of this reversal would have been poetic if the stakes weren't so serious. Jake, Patricia addressed the young developer directly. We're offering you permanent senior developer status under Tammy's technical leadership, with legal protections ensuring you face no liability for unwitting participation in Richard's fraudulent scheme. Jake's relief was visible. Thank you. I want to make it clear that I never knowingly participated in intellectual property theft, and I'm prepared to provide full cooperation with any investigations. Margaret handed Richard a final set of documents. These papers formalize your termination for cause and require your immediate departure from company premises. Security will escort you to collect personal items under supervision. As if summoned by her words, 2 data flow security officers appeared at the conference room door. Richard's transformation from CEO to escorted ex-employee represented one of the most dramatic reversals of corporate fortune I'd ever witnessed. "This isn't over," Richard declared desperately. "I'll challenge these actions through litigation and expose this conspiracy to destroy legitimate business leadership." "Richard," Jonathan replied with legal precision, "any further actions against Dataflow or Miss Patterson will be considered harassment and potential obstruction of federal investigations. I strongly advise immediate consultation with criminal defense counsel." As security escorted Richard from the building, Patricia turned to me with an expression combining respect and business pragmatism. "Tammy, Dataflow needs ethical technical leadership that can rebuild investor confidence while ensuring legal compliance. Are you interested in helping us recover from this crisis?" Looking around the conference room where my career had been destroyed and then reborn within 24 hours, I realized this opportunity represented more than personal vindication. It offered the chance to establish industry precedents protecting other innovators from intellectual property theft. "I'm very interested in that conversation," I replied, feeling the weight of justice finally settling into place. 6 months later, I stood in the corner office that had once belonged to Richard Patterson, now serving as Dataflow Solutions' Chief Technology Officer, while leading a team that had grown from 8 developers to 23. The view from the 22nd floor showed downtown's financial district spreading beneath spring sunshine, a vista that seemed to reflect the company's dramatic transformation from near disaster to industry leadership. My laptop displayed performance metrics that told an extraordinary story of corporate recovery. Our corrected encryption algorithm had generated a 40% increase in client contracts, with financial institutions specifically seeking Dataflow's services because of our enhanced security protocols and transparent intellectual property practices. The Series B funding round had closed at $15 million, $3 million above our original target, as investors responded enthusiastically to our ethical leadership transition. Jake Morrison knocked on my office door, holding a tablet showing client implementation results. His growth from unwitting accomplice in Richard's fraud to trusted technical leader had been remarkable to witness. "Tammy, the Federal Reserve Bank implementation is exceeding all performance benchmarks. Their security team wants to discuss expanding our contract to cover international wire transfer protocols." "Outstanding news," I replied, reviewing the detailed metrics he'd prepared. Jake's attention to security documentation had become exemplary, partly from genuine technical interest but also from healthy respect for the legal implications of cryptographic implementation. "Schedule a requirements meeting for next week, and include Sarah in the preliminary discussions." Sarah Chen had been promoted to Chief People Officer 3 months ago, implementing comprehensive intellectual property protection policies that had become an industry model. Her experience witnessing Richard's exploitation of employees had motivated her to create structural safeguards, preventing future theft, while encouraging innovation through proper recognition and compensation. My phone displayed a text from Dr. Ellen Rodriguez. "Saw the TechCrunch article about Dataflow's turnaround. Proud of how you transformed crisis into industry leadership. Coffee this weekend to discuss the academic partnership proposal?" Dr. Rodriguez now served on Dataflow's advisory board, helping establish connections between our commercial development and university research programs. Her early warnings about corporate intellectual property vulnerabilities had proven prophetic, and her ongoing guidance ensured we maintained ethical standards while pursuing aggressive growth. The partnership proposal she referenced would create internship programs, giving graduate students practical cryptography experience, while ensuring their academic work received proper protection and attribution. It represented exactly the kind of systemic change that could prevent other innovators from experiencing the theft I'd survived. Marcus Thompson appeared in my doorway with characteristic enthusiasm, his database architecture expertise having proved invaluable during our rapid expansion. Tammy, Patricia wants to discuss the European expansion timeline. Our London clients are requesting on-site security auditing capabilities that could justify opening regional offices. Patricia Williams had proven to be an exceptional board chair, her venture capital experience providing strategic guidance that balanced aggressive growth with sustainable business practices. Her decisive action during Richard's crisis had saved Dataflow from catastrophic legal exposure while demonstrating her commitment to ethical leadership standards. Tell Patricia I'll have preliminary staffing projections ready by tomorrow, I replied. European expansion represents a logical next step, but we need to ensure our intellectual property protections remain robust across international jurisdictions. The international considerations were complex but exciting. Thomas Chen had helped establish legal frameworks ensuring our patents remained protected in European markets, while our employee inventor rights policies complied with various national employment standards. His expertise had been crucial during the past 6 months of rapid legal and business development. My computer chimed with an email from the Federal Trade Commission's Cybersecurity Division, requesting our participation in developing new industry standards for financial encryption protocols. The recognition represented validation of our technical leadership, while offering opportunities to influence broader industry practices protecting consumer data privacy. But the most satisfying development had been the criminal resolution of Richard's fraud case. Federal prosecutors had secured guilty pleas for patent fraud and willful intellectual property theft, resulting in 18 months imprisonment, plus substantial financial penalties. The conviction had established important legal precedent, strengthening protections for employee inventors while demonstrating serious consequences for corporate intellectual property theft. Jake interrupted my reflection with additional good news. The nonprofit foundation paperwork has been approved. The Employee Inventor Legal Defense Fund is officially operational, with initial funding from Dataflow plus contributions from 3 other technology companies. This foundation represented my most important legacy from the entire experience. Providing legal support for technical employees facing intellectual property theft would prevent other innovators from suffering the isolation and vulnerability I'd experienced. Dr. Rodriguez served as the Foundation's academic advisor while Thomas Chen provided legal oversight, ensuring comprehensive protection for legitimate inventor rights. Have you scheduled the first grant review meeting? I asked, feeling genuine pride in this systematic approach to preventing future exploitation. Next Tuesday at 10 a.m., Jake confirmed. We already have 12 applications from developers facing various forms of corporate intellectual property abuse. The demand for legal support clearly exceeds our initial projections. Sarah knocked and entered with additional updates. Tammy, the Society of Women Engineers wants you to keynote their national conference next month. The topic is Protecting Innovation Through Legal Preparedness. The audience should be over 2,000 female technical professionals. These speaking engagements had become an unexpected but important part of my role as Dataflow's CTO. Sharing my experience helped other innovators understand their legal rights, while encouraging systematic documentation practices that could prevent intellectual property theft. The audiences consistently responded with questions revealing widespread vulnerability to the kind of exploitation Richard had attempted. Confirm the keynote appearance, I decided, and ask them to record the presentation for broader distribution. The legal preparedness message needs to reach beyond conference attendees. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for the day's final meeting, a video conference with international cybersecurity researchers collaborating on quantum-resistant encryption standards. This technical work represented the natural evolution of the innovations Richard had tried to steal, now developed through proper academic and commercial partnerships that respected intellectual property rights while advancing the field. As afternoon shadows lengthened across my office, I reflected on the mathematical precision of justice that had transformed personal disaster into professional triumph. Richard's theft had backfired so completely that it created opportunities I never could have imagined while working in his shadow. The broader impact extended far beyond personal vindication. Dataflow's transformation had demonstrated that ethical leadership produced superior business results, while our legal victories had strengthened protections for innovators throughout the technology industry. The nonprofit foundation would provide ongoing support for employees facing intellectual property theft, while our speaking engagements and academic partnerships spread awareness of legal protections that could prevent future exploitation. Most importantly, the systematic changes we'd implemented ensured that Dataflow would never again enable the kind of theft Richard had attempted. Our intellectual property policies protected employee innovations, while our ethical leadership standards prevented exploitation of technical contributions. The company culture now celebrated authentic innovation while providing legal safeguards, ensuring proper attribution and compensation. As I prepared to leave the office, I realized that Richard's betrayal had ultimately catalyzed positive changes that extended far beyond our immediate situation. His attempt to destroy my career had instead created opportunities to protect other innovators, while establishing industry standards that would benefit countless technical professionals facing similar vulnerabilities. The view from my window showed the city's financial district transitioning to evening lights, each building representing companies that could benefit from the precedents we'd established and the protections we'd created. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to advance both Dataflow's mission and the broader cause of intellectual property justice. But tonight, I felt profound satisfaction knowing that systematic change had emerged from personal crisis, transforming individual suffering into collective protection that would serve the innovation community for years to come. Have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to take credit for your work or ideas? How did you handle it? And what would you do differently, knowing what legal protections might be available? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you to learn more about protecting your intellectual property, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right. Don't forget to share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding their legal rights in the workplace. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to justice. And remember that sometimes our greatest setbacks become the foundation for our most meaningful victories.